So we've got the background of the Weimar Republic, but I just quickly want to put it out there that we're still going to go back to the interwar period and Treaty of Versailles, but we're going to bring it up in the context of the Weimar. So we're starting at the dot point where it's the rise of the Nazi Party and Hitler in Germany and the collapse of the Weimar Republic. So here's how it all starts. So the Kaiser gets abdicated and the monarchy is abolished. So we're like, okay, we need a new system. But then there's all these different groups. There's the SDP, there's the Spartacists, there's Revolutionary Socialism, all these different groups, and everyone's trying to come together on what to do. So then they declare the new republic, and then that is the birth of the Weimar Republic. So they held the elections in 1919, and then the SDP formed a coalition with the Democrats and the Catholic Center so that they could have their majority government. But it was still the Republic, and they had Scheidemann as a chancellor. Hitler and the Nazi Party. So Hitler emerges as a party leader by 1921. He was the one who personally designed the Nazi Party banner, and you guys probably know about the 25-point program, which outlines the party platform and kind of their ideology. Other members attempted to halt his rise to power, but his offer was rejected because he played such a key role in the party when he tried, when he was told that his power was too dictatorial, and it was just a whole manipulation thing. So you guys probably already know that with Hitler, but he always found a way to be at the top. But the Nazi Party membership grew really, really, really rapidly. By 1923, it was already at 55,000 members, which is insane. So a key pattern that you're going to notice, and I really want to stress this, is that the Weimar failure is why the Nazi Party succeeded. This is so important. This is a great first sentence if you get a question on the Weimar, or if you get a question on why the Nazi Party succeeded. The Weimar's failure was a direct catalyst for the Nazi Party success, and that's just a really good, I feel like in modern, making connections like these is so important because they're your theses in these short answers. So the Nazi Party capitalized on the failures of the Weimar Republic in order to secure popular support. So because the Weimar Republic was so bad and they were struggling and failing so bad economically, politically, everything, socially, the Nazi parties, they literally capitalized that. They highlighted their failures, and then that made them look better. But it's not necessarily anything that the Nazi Party was specifically doing. It was just that the Weimar was so bad that everyone was like, oh, the Nazi Party must be great. Okay, so the rise of the Nazi Party and Hitler, when we're looking at the constitutional flaws of the Weimar, and my recommendation for modern is always split it up into themes. I feel like thematically it makes a lot more sense. So you can talk about the failures of the Weimar, but split it up into the political failures, the social failures, the economic failures, and that way if you have a point for each, it's spread across the board and it's more general rather than just focusing on the constitutional flaws. And I recommend that for your essays as well. I know you guys haven't gotten, or a lot of you guys haven't gotten into the national study yet. But when you do, splitting it into themes and looking at the social factors, the political factors, military factors, and splitting up thematically really helps grab those band 6 marks. So the big problem with the constitution of the Weimar was that they had proportional representation because there were all these little groups and no one could come together to agree. So there was no majority, and they couldn't get to one point. So in the end, they were pretty useless because they weren't really passing any laws. So it made it impossible for the party to secure a majority. And if you can't secure the majority, then it's going to be really hard to get laws passed. So they didn't really end up doing anything. So then they were like, okay, well, there's no majority, which is what we see in the infographic up here. They were like, let's form the coalition. And they thought if we do this, we get larger parties aligning with the smaller parties. But then the larger parties were compromising themselves and the smaller parties were getting disproportionate power. So it really wasn't working. And then another really important factor that everyone, when it comes to Weimar Republic, please remember Article 48, because Hitler literally used that to his advantage and was one of the biggest catalysts for him rising to power. But Article 48 was that the president could rule without consulting the Reichstag in an emergency. which can obviously be abused in order of the dictatorship, which is what Hitler did. So he used this rule that they implemented, called an emergency, and that literally was the point that he rose to power. So Article 48 is very important to remember when we're talking about the Weimar. I want you guys to consider this. So this is actually from my trial. I got it from my trial paper. But it's how does source A reflect the reasons for the collapse of the Weimar Republic? So in this, what you can do, because it's an image, I feel like images in modern, especially when they're like, it's not like a photo source, it's like a factual source. So this really threw me off because it was the first time that I had seen like a source like this, like in an exam. But what you can do here is you can kind of use, like you do in English, and you look at like the techniques in the photos. When you look at it, all the different colors represent all the different parties. So when we're talking about the constitutional flaws of the Weimar Republic, a big one is how there were too many different parties and they can't pass laws, which are represented by the different colors. So that itself is already a really good point to make, and that's the biggest constitutional flaw. And then you can also go into detail on how it gives you the names of the different parties. And if you compare Catholic Center to Communist to National Socialists or the German Peoples, there's obviously different interests within those groups, and very like differing ideologies. So when you have so many different groups with so many different ideologies who are refusing to come together and agree, how is anything going to be passed? So then you can say that the reason for the collapse of the Weimar Republic was because of proportional representation and the lack of a majority displayed through all the different colors. And then you can also make the point that by 1933, the Nazi Party had complete control. But that's a 3 marker, and it's not like, I feel like in modern, with the short answers, everyone really pressures themselves to write like these really great, like these solid, like 10 out of 10 responses. But in the 3 markers, and especially in the shorter marks, they're not looking for much. They really want a pretty solid answer and then just some backup. And for this, that would be 3 out of 3, and that's what I wrote in mine, and that was 3 out of 3. So with the shorter marks, don't worry about putting too much effort. Definitely when it gets up to higher marks, when it's 6+, especially if you get a 12 marker, that is where we're going to switch our brains onto work mode. Okay, let's talk about the Treaty of Versailles for a bit. The Weimar Republic, in relation to the Weimar Republic, they were blamed for the harshness of the Treaty of Versailles. So some of the terms of the treaty included reparations, which were 132 billion gold marks. I know with statistics and with numbers, everyone's all over the place, and some people are like, don't worry about memorizing, or you need to memorize everything. When it comes to the treaty, I recommend memorizing the 132 billion gold marks, just because it is like a specific detail, and it can make your answer just a bit more solid. But you don't need to remember like all the really specifics. Like I've got here, like the Treaty of Versailles was crippling. They had territorial concessions, 1 million square miles and 6 million subjects. Like you don't need to know like exactly. I'd say the deaths, so there were 600,000 plus civilian deaths for Germany, and 69.4% of all their mobilized soldiers were killed or injured. But there were also limits of Germany's military, and then the war guilt clause, which completely blamed Germany entirely for the entire war. So you can use different things, but I'd say these 4 here are the big ones. And then they claim them and the Weimar Republic as the November criminals, and Hitler was very big on creating this stab in the back legend, but everyone else kind of backed it up, and it was a conspiracy between leftist Weimar politicians, communists, and Jews to sabotage the war effort. So they blamed the Weimar, they blamed communists, and they blamed Jews, and said that it was their fault, and they stabbed them in the back by signing that guilt clause, and they're the reason Germany is struggling financially, socially, politically. They blamed everything on those 3 groups. And then when you look at it, the Weimar collapsed, they were out of the picture, and then Hitler's main targets were communists and Jews. So this stab in the back legend was really something that he was a strong proponent of, and he campaigned it so hard that his Nazi party was reversing the Treaty of Versailles, so that he could gain support. So the Treaty of Versailles is very big when it comes to, I feel like they can ask you about it individually, and they can just ask you what were the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles on Russia, or what were the consequences on Germany and Italy, for example. But they can be sneaky and ask you about it in the context of the Weimar, which is why, again, it's good to know the connection. And I recommend it all the time in modern history, but it's good to connect dot points where you can, because those connections make your theses and your answers much stronger, but they also show off to your marker. And guys, with HSC marking, I don't want to freak you out, but especially modern and how content heavy it is, these markers are marking like hundreds of papers every night, hundreds of same responses. You don't know if they're in a good mood. You don't know if they just got divorced. You don't know if they're depressed. You don't know what they're going through. You don't know if they're in a great mood, and it, so good if they are. But when it comes to marking, like if they're marking late at night, what if you're the last paper and they just want to mark you really quick, or they're in a really bad mood because their class annoyed them that day? You don't know the mood of the HSC markers. And not that you should be subject to that, but in saying that, I think it's always good to just show off to your marker a little and just take those little steps to just do something a little bit extra. I'm not saying for a 3 marker, write a whole page response, because that's just dumb. That's just dumb to really, really go over the lines and write like this massive response for something small. But little things like these and these little tricks where it's make a connection or connect one catalyst to the other, go like one line over, have the specific 132 billion gold marks instead of saying that the consequences were reparations. Those little tricks are what makes you stand out to those types of markers who are in a bad mood or who aren't really, feeling it. It sucks to say that, but realistically, they're marking so much. You don't know who these teachers are. I don't know if you guys have good modern teachers, bad modern teachers, but it just depends. And I think that this trick is kind of foolproof because you write a stronger response, and whether they're in a bad mood or good mood, they can't really mark you down for that, or they can't look beyond that. Like, they have to acknowledge what's there. And even if they're not in the mood to acknowledge what's there, you've gone a step ahead, so they're forced to. So it's kind of manipulate the manipulative markers and get around them. That's my advice. Okay, we're going to talk about the rise of extreme right nationalism, which starts with the RUHR Putsch, where Hitler and the Bavarian leadership unite to take over Munich. They storm the RUHR meeting and declare that the national revolution has begun. The Nazis entered there, but this is where Hitler gets arrested. The Nazi party's banned. He uses his trial as a way to generate support, and it was front page on the newspapers for weeks and weeks, which really brought even more and more attention to him. And then obviously in jail, that's where he wrote Mein Kampf. If you guys are looking for quotes to use for Hitler, I really recommend getting them from Mein Kampf, only because obviously it's a primary source, it's written by him, but it shows a lot about the Nazi ideology by the creator of Nazism. So I recommend, if you are looking for historian quotes for the core, that's a good place to start, especially primary quotes, primary sources. But the RUHR Putsch was actually good for Hitler because he realized that the revolution wasn't the way to forward for the Nazi party. They needed to gain power legitimately, constitutionally. And that's where they realized that they could capitalize on the failures of the Weimar rather than revolutionizing and turning to violence, and causing commotion with the army and everything. So back to Weimar and how bad they are. The Weimar government was really struggling to keep up with reparation repayments. And then the occupation of the Ruhr began, where France and Belgium sent troops to take control. The Weimar ordered passive resistance against the French aggression. But the RUHR was occupied, and because of that, their industrial production fell and the German economy experienced hyperinflation. So I want you guys to start noticing the patterns, and I hope you can. We just looked at the constitutional failures and politically why the Weimar was struggling, and that's because of proportional representation. Now we're looking economically why the Weimar was struggling, and that was because of hyperinflation as a direct result of struggling to keep up with the reparation payments, and France and Belgium's occupation of the RUHR, which was their industrial heartland. So if they don't have control over their literal industry heartland, how are they going to generate money? And that's why the German economy struggled so badly. So when I talk about thematically, it's good to split them up. And if you are writing notes or if you wanted to take it down, that's the way that I would split them up. Now, in terms of understanding hyperinflation, guys, I know I'm teaching business studies, but I didn't do economics, but this is as basic as it gets. The hypothetical economy, bread costs $1. Bread costs $1. But in the hypothetical economy that's experiencing hyperinflation, bread costs $2. So the price of things are going up. So purchasing power prior to inflation. But then when you're experiencing hyperinflation, everything gets more and more expensive. So in Germany, things were becoming 4 times more expensive, then 6 times more expensive, then 10 times more expensive, and then it just went off the charts. So the government's response was so bad. They printed more money. They were like, no money. We're experiencing inflation. Let's just print more money. But then that just encouraged inflation further because the value of the marks were decreasing. I know everyone makes that joke and it's like, why don't we just print more money? But that literally decreases the value of money, and just worsens the conditions of the economy. And then paper money was rendered useless. So they went back to the old system of bartering. And by the end of 1923, a loaf of bread was 201 billion marks. But they cost 0.63 marks in 1918. So in the span of 5 years, it went from 0.63 to 201 billion. 201 billion for a loaf of bread. You could not catch me paying that much for bread. Sorry. It's not happening. But it affected different groups in different ways. For the working class, well, they didn't really have no savings to lose because they didn't have money. But they did face unemployment and they were unable to afford all these exorbitant prices. For the middle class, they lost all their savings. Their rent was inflated and they also had to suffer with unemployment. And upper classes and foreigners benefited from inflated rental prices or their currency because they were renting out and obviously had properties and prices were going up. So they were benefiting off that profit of the prices going up. So, of course, the upper class is living life loving and the working class and middle class is really, really struggling. And Stresemann calls off passive resistance in the RUHR, and then he introduces the Rentenmark. Now, I want to go a bit into Stresemann because he is a real one. I feel like even here, we've gone straight to the Great Depression, but Stresemann really turned around, and it's just sad that he died right before the Great Depression started because he was turning around the entire kind of state and was really helping them economically. So I like to call it the calm before the storm, or kind of the golden years. That's what they refer to. But the in-between period, and I hope you guys can note down just about Stresemann if your teacher didn't go into big detail on him, because I know my teacher didn't, and then I was reading about it and I found out in a textbook, and then I ended up using it in one of my responses. But the Weimar was really, really struggling, but I feel like it's unfair to be like the Weimar was so horrible and so bad. And in modern, this is another piece of advice. It's never good to always look at the bad or always look at the good. It's always good to look at the balance. So even like with every source, there is no source that is perfect. There can be like a really great source, but there's got to be one limitation of it. You don't want to just write about how great it is. You also want to talk about how limited it is, or how it might be factually reliable, but in terms of ideology, in terms of attitude, is it as reliable, or is it just showing one side? And even when you come to do the national study, you want to look at like the successes and the failures. So when we're looking at the Weimar Republic, it's really easy, and when we're making this point that the Weimar failure was the reason for the Nazi success, it's really easy to be like, okay, well, these are all the failures. But then you're looking too much on the extremes on one side and not enough on the other. So yes, we've been looking at the constitutional failures and the economic failures, but if we're looking at the successes of the Weimar Republic, that comes in with Stresemann. He detested the Treaty of Versailles and he wanted to regain international prestige. So he was like, okay, let's make the treaty work for them. And this was in between 1924 and 1929. So he had 3 specific plans that helped build up the reputation of the Weimar again. So one was the Dawes Plan, where it fixed annual reparation payments at a manageable level, and it increased Americans' loans to Germany. So America was loaning even more money to Germany, which helped revive the economy. And that was great because they could get some more money in. And then France also assured within this Dawes plans that they would leave the RUHR within a year, which means America's loaning them more money. Yay, we have more money, we can help our economy. And the France was going to leave the RUHR, which was their industrial heartland, which means they can get back to production and producing at the level that they were. So that's already great. Then comes the Locarno Treaties between 1925, which was between Britain, France, and Germany. And this legitimized the Belgium-German borders and the France-German borders, but it also allowed Germany entry into the League of Nations, which they were banned from joining during the Treaty of Versailles. So he really detested and kind of was going back to the treaty and changing the conditions of it through peace. And then Germany ended up entering and being allowed access into the League of Nations. So that just shows that, yes, the Weimar was bad in that area, but Stresemann really came in, and there were successes. And then the Young Plan of 1929 revisited reparations. It brought an end to the military occupation in the Rhineland. And then Germany started again to become a cultural and technological hub. They were getting back on their really high production levels and really succeeding. So that's why they call them the golden years. And it's between 1924 and 1929. But the big guy who did it is Stresemann. The issue is a month before the Great Depression starts, Stresemann dies. So this great guy who's doing all this great stuff for Germany and all this great stuff for the Weimar Republic, literally reversing the Treaty of Versailles, making everybody happy, he dies. And then a month later, they're like, hey, it's the Great Depression. So the Great Depression starts, but the issue was that the economy was too tied with the US. And the Great Depression obviously started with the fall of Wall Street in America. So when Wall Street fell and the US economy fell, so did Germany. And like I said, in the Dawes Plan, America increased their loans to Germany under Stresemann. So that meant that there was even more money that they originally wouldn't have had to owe back now that they owed. So the American loans were no longer available. American tariffs were an issue, and obviously America was trying to build back up their economy, so they wanted their money back after increasing their loans. By 1932, industrial production in Germany was at 58% of its 1928 levels. So there was really, really big mass employment. And the Weimar government, surprise, responded poorly. So they were like, oh no, the Great Depression, everyone's suffering economically. Let's raise taxes and cut wages. That's how we're going to make money. And then Chancellor Brüning asked Hindenburg to invoke Article 48 to pass on unpopular deflationary policies. But then Hindenburg used that and dissolved the Reichstag and called for new elections, which is where Hitler starts campaigning. So in 1928, the Nazi Party only had 12 seats in the Reichstag, but by 1932, after the Great Depression, they had 107. And here we've got a quote from a historian, Stephen Lee: "The non-manual employees, civil servants, and teachers who aligned themselves with Nazism were a direct result of the Depression." So a lot of people, out of kind of like a last resort, and even civil servants, teachers, and non-manual employees turned to Nazism because the Weimar had just consistently kept failing them. They had, and when you look at it, like the Weimar was doing really bad politically and economically. Then Stresemann comes in and it looks like he fixes things and it's going back up. Then he dies and the Great Depression starts and it goes straight back down. And the reason it took like a really sharp and like a steep like downhill track is also because Stresemann under his plan increased American loans, which now tied them even further and made the effect even worse. So people were just kind of at a last resort, and a lot of people started to support the Nazi Party. And again, that's because of the failures of the Weimar Republic in handling the Great Depression. So